So, good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to have you here. My name is Geeta, and this is Tamara, and we are co-facilitating this session called Talking to Your Kids About Race. We're really excited to be here today. We've done this workshop in a number of schools across the board, and it's great to have a good-looking room of, a good-sized room of people in here. So hoping to get through a bunch of stuff and have some good conversations in the chat box too. All right, so we'll jump in. First of all, we need to thank the sponsors for the conference. They're all on this slide. So there you go. Thank you to all of them. And then we'll get started. So this workshop is called Talking to Your Kids About Race. So this is something that a lot of us do, a lot of us educators. So actually, I'll take a second to introduce myself more properly, and Tamara can do that too. I am a secondary teacher in the TDSB. I have also worked in the central office in the equity office as a student equity program advisor, as well as a learning coach, where working with teachers around all sorts of issues, but specifically a lot of that work is focused on issues of equity and anti-racism. Tamara?
Yes, I am also a secondary teacher. I teach at a school in the northwest end of the city. Prior to this, I worked with the equity department as a teacher equity coach. And then prior to that, as a K-12 learning coach, where a big part of our focus was doing equity work with schools and with families. I would say it wasn't all focused on race, but we did a lot of work around race, anti-homophobia work, anti-Islamophobia work, etc. And I'm really happy to be here with you all today.
Great. So yes, this workshop is obviously very timely right now. It's actually been timely for many years, or some would say for many generations. So we intend to not close everything up today, but open this conversation amongst parents here, and just noting that this is an ongoing conversation that we will need to be having over the course of our lives, that many people in this room have probably been having for many years as well, with amongst yourselves and with your children as well. So our agenda for today is one, to talk about race, racism, and bias, including implicit bias and explicit bias. This will just give us a sort of common shared understanding of some of the terms that we're using, so that we can move forward with that shared understanding. We'll quickly touch on policies against discrimination of all forms, including Ontario Human Rights Code, as well as other TDSB policies. And then we'll get into sort of like the big chunk of this, which is strategies for having conversations with your children about race, why that's so important, and what are some ways that we can do that. Okay, so we're gonna do a quick sort of check-in and introduction for people in the room. I think there's 18 of us in here, but a couple of people are in here twice, so maybe about 15 of us. If in the chat box, you could please share what your name is, what your pronoun is. So for some people that might be he, him, she, her, they, them. It's just to make sure that if we are addressing each other in the room, that we do that in the most respectful way possible, and we're honoring the pronouns that each person uses and not making assumptions about that. And if you're in here and you have children, what grades they're in. So go ahead and do that in the chat box now. Awesome. Thanks for the people that have done that, and keep them coming in. I see that we have quite a range of grades, children's grades represented here, everything from JK all the way up to, I think, 14 years old or so, all the way up to high school. Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for introducing yourselves. It's really nice to share this space with you.
This next slide is, we would like to just in line with ensuring that we are engaging with each other in the most respectful way possible throughout this workshop today, or this session today. Geetha and I wanted to share the 4 agreements that we often use when we are having conversations with teachers, but we would argue that they are useful in conversations that we're having with anybody around race and racism. And they actually come from a book called Courageous Conversations About Race by Glenn E. Singleton. And they are here on the screen. I'm actually going to read them to you, and we will read everything that is on the screen today just for the sake of, for the purpose of accessibility. So the first one is stay engaged, remain morally, emotionally, intellectually, and socially involved in the conversation. The second is experience discomfort. Discomfort in conversations about race and racism is inevitable. Only through dialogue will change begin. Speak your truth. And I'd like to add there, speak from the I. So be open about expressing your feelings. Don't just say what you think others want to hear in the discussion, but also ensure that you're speaking from your experience, not speaking on behalf of anyone else. And then finally, the fourth one is to expect and accept non-closure. Uncertainty will continue even after today's session. So continue to be open to further dialogue. That's with your child, with your family, with the school, and with those in your community.
So before we move on from there, oh yeah, Tamara, do you want to put the name in the chat? And maybe we can just ask, does anyone have anything they'd like to add to these agreements? This format is not super user friendly in terms of having dialogue and opening the space up for real conversation. We're going to obviously try to do that through the chat, but is there anything that anyone would like to add to this that would make you feel good about the conversation today? So would you prefer us to put our video on when we're able during this session? I think my take on that is it's completely up to you. And it's the same for our students. We don't ask our students to put on their video necessarily because we don't know anything about, we don't necessarily know if they're comfortable with doing that and what their home life is like, what their home is like, and we don't want to put that pressure on students. It is an equity issue. So similarly, there's no pressure here to put your video on, only if you'd like to. Great. So one thing that I did want to add to the agreements is just an understanding that it kind of goes with speak your truth, but just an understanding that people in this room come from lots of different walks of life and from lots of lived experiences with racism. Some people could have, like a whole life lived worth of experiences with racial violence and with supporting their kids through racial violence and harassment and discrimination and oppression. And for others, this might be a newer conversation or one that you haven't had as much before. So we want to recognize that there is a diversity of experience and wisdom in the room, but that some people do have a lot more of that lived experience with the subject matter. Yes, that's true. Esther, thank you for pointing that out. So the Parents as Partners conference is, they would like to record all the sessions. So we do have this being recorded right now. So if you have an issue with that, maybe just note it in the chat and also just consider that when you're putting your video on or off.
Okay, assuming that there was nothing else in terms of agreements that folks wanted to add to the chat, we are going to try a Mentimeter. What I'm asking you to do is we are asking that you share some words that you would use to describe how you feel about talking to your children about race. So one way that you can do this is by just using your cell phone and going to the camera option if you have a cell phone, and a working camera on that cell phone, you can use the QR code that's on the screen and just put your camera right up to that QR code. And it's going to prompt you to open something called a Mentimeter. When you open that, it will give you a space for you to answer the question. There is also the option if you're using your phone for this session, for example, you may not be able to also use it to scan the code. So you can also go to this link that I just dropped into the chat box and enter the code that's there. And it will also give you an opportunity to add the words that come to mind in terms of how you feel about talking to your children or child about race. So we'll just give everyone a minute or two to try that out. Okay, we can see lots of words popping up here. I will share it with you in just maybe we'll give folks, Geetha, do you think about another minute? There's still lots of words popping up.
Yep, that sounds great.
Okay.
Wow, this is really interesting.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop sharing my screen and then I will.
We can see it now. We can
Oh,
see
can you?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Not anymore. We could see it a minute ago. We could
How
see
about
it right
now?
before we did that.
Okay. Okay, so the trouble is when you can see it, I can't see it.
Okay, so maybe you can put it back on and then I'll read it out.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. So these are some of the words that showed up. And the way that a Mentimeter works is that any words that were more common are featured in larger font on this Mentimeter. So the two big words in the middle are confident and unsure, which is really interesting because they're complete opposites. Some other things we have on there: engaged, motivated, eager, authentic, capable, empowered, challenged, uncomfortable, confused, afraid, concerned, hesitant, responsible, cautious, complicated, right, urgent, scared, white parents need to, scared I'll get it wrong, difficult, necessary, uncertain, equally important, and justice.
Wow, those are great words. I think that confident and unsure in the middle is also really interesting and probably speaks a bit to the folks that are in the room, feeling Some people, just like in any situation, some people, might feel that they have the tools to do that well, and others feel unsure. But that's part of the reason why we're here today. So hopefully, those of you who are feeling unsure are going to leave here feeling a little more confident about it. And maybe those of you who are feeling confident will have a few more tools um, to add to your toolkit.
And Tamara, is there anything else on there that really stands out to you?
Um, I can't, I'm not sure that I'm seeing all the things that you're seeing. But I think what another thing that stood out to me was being scared that the person would get it wrong. I think that's a feeling that lots of us have. And again, like hopefully that's something that we will address throughout this session today. But one thing that I'd like to say about it right now is that um, the only way to really get it wrong is to remain silent and do nothing about it at all. As long as you are investing the time and energy into doing as much learning as you can and talking to others about the questions that you have, those who are knowledgeable in the communities that you are trying to educate your child about, then there really is no way to get it really wrong. It's anti-racism is about constantly asking yourself those questions and constantly being willing to learn more so that you can do better. What about you, Geeta? Was there anything that stood out to you on the list?
One thing that stood out to me was white parents need to. That's something that we're going to be talking about today because this is a conversation that a lot of racialized families, a lot of people of color have had to have just for, and we'll get to this, but just out of a survival need. This conversation has been very critical for a lot of parents to have with their children, but for some parents, it never, when you have the option not to have it, that often those are the kids that are perpetuating racism in schools and on the playground, or the kids that have never been exposed to these ideas outside of the mainstream media or stereotypes that exist in culturally in schools. So absolutely, it's just as important, if not more, that white parents talk to their children about racism. So it's great that that came up too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you should see 4 images on the screen in front of you. And what we're asking for you to do is just to think about, for today's session, which one of these images really resonates with you and why? We're going to ask you, if you're comfortable, to just identify the image. You can just say like the t-shirt, the turkey, the crayons, or the fist, to identify the image in the chat box. And if you can, very briefly, explain why that image resonates with you. We aren't going to have a deep and rich discussion about these 4 images, but some of the issues that come to mind for us when we are thinking about, or when we chose these images, really link well to some of the discussion that we're hoping to have as we go throughout today's presentation or today's session. So we'll try to make some connections between some of the issues that might arise for you around these and some of the things that we're going to be discussing throughout the rest of the session today. I'm not sure if folks are able to keep an eye on the chat. Is it helpful for us to read these aloud for you? We are going to read the things that are on the screen, but I'm not sure if everyone can see the chat. So that's important just in terms of how we're able to engage with each other. So I hope that everyone does have access to that.
Iram, I just wanted you to know you sent your message privately to me. I'm not sure if you meant to or to send it to everybody, just so you know. It's okay. It's not a problem. I just wanted to let you know in case you wanted everyone to see it.
Okay, so there are a lot of really great points being made in the chat box. When you have a chance, when you're not working on your own, maybe you can just scan those and take a look at what others are saying and which of these images is resonating for other people today. Um, I do just want to quickly note that a few people have mentioned the importance of intersectionality, and that is something that Geeta and I will try to do throughout the session today as much as possible, because it's really important to discussions around oppression and racism, and we often don't do a great job of it. So that's something that we are cognizant of and will try to tie into every aspect of today's session.
Tamara, do you think we should define intersectionality just for people that aren't familiar with that language?
Yeah, I think we should. So when I'm saying intersectionality, what I'm thinking about is the idea that, or the fact that, none of us is defined simply by one aspect of our social location. So I am a Black person. I am also a woman, and that the intersection of those two identities means that I interact, or the world interacts with me in a very different way than it might engage with a person who is Black, but a male instead of a woman. Um, I I think that often in these discussions we leave out trans folks and lesbian, gay, two-spirited folks. And I think it's important for us to think about, and also those varying abilities, physical and mental abilities. And so I think when we're talking about intersectionality, it's looking at how all of those aspects of our identities connect with each other.
There's a really good question in the chat. If we're talking about race or anti-racism, why do we need to talk about intersectionality? So let me give an example. When Black Lives Matter Toronto stopped the Pride Parade a couple of years ago, a lot of people were saying, well, why, if this is an issue that if Black Lives Matter has an issue about anti-Black racism, why are they disrupting, why are they bringing it into an area where where people are talking about homophobia or gay LGBTQ rights? So the separation of those two things by a lot of the public really resulted in the erasure of LGBTQ Black folks. There are many LGBTQ Black folks and racialized people in the queer community, but separating those two communities like that it kind of erased the fact that there are people that exist in both of them. So we have to always consider that even though we're talking about racism, a lot of racialized folks, there are so many racialized trans people, so many racialized queer people, racialized people with disabilities. So we have to make sure that's why it's necessary to talk about all of these things at once instead of just looking at race. There are also specific issues that Black trans women, for example, face that Black men might not face, even though they share the identity of race. So that's one of the reasons why this is so important to talk about how identities come together to form the particular experiences that certain people have. Some of which are shared, like Tamara and I are both women. We share that experience of being women, but we have different experiences when it comes to race, even though we're both women of color. So I think it's just bringing a much more nuanced approach to discussions of identity rather than just looking at one identity, one sort of like arena or area, which is race. I hope that answers your question. Okay, should we move forward?
Sure. So part of what we wanted to do was just make sure that we're all talking about the same thing today. So I'm going to share a few definitions with the group in order to ensure that we're building a common understanding of a few of these terms. So as I said, I'm going to read directly from the screen. So it is here in front of you, but I just want to make sure that it's accessible to everyone. So what is race? Race is a false classification of people that is not based on any real or accurate biological or scientific truth. It's socially constructed, so it's just like gender and ability. And by that, what we mean is that it's outside of the society that we live in, it wouldn't exist in the way that it does. So if we go to other places in the world, um, ideas like gender, ability, and race might actually change definition. They may be understood in a different way because they're constructed by the societies that we live in. Um, Another really important aspect of this is that it impacts every single aspect of our lives. So if you are a Black person, going out into the street affects you in a very specific way. It doesn't just affect your like walk to school, for example. It affects you once you get into that building, even though we say everyone in the school building, we believe that all students should be treated equally. The way that teachers see Black students is different from the way that teachers see students who might identify as Asian or as white or as, from another group. External characteristics such as skin color, hair texture, and facial features are also attributed to race. So if anyone would like to share their own, if you have a different understanding or if this somehow challenges something that you believe about race, or you would like to add something to that, you may feel free to do so in the chat. And I'm just going to move on to the next definition that we are offering, which is what is racism? So we're going to just share two types of racism, although it is a much more complex issue than this. The first is interpersonal racism, and this refers to an individual's, so just a person's, racist assumptions, beliefs, or behaviors. And it stems from conscious and unconscious personal prejudice. And this is really important. Geeta and I don't have time to get into a deeper discussion about this part, but when racist actions occur, they occur because there is an unconscious belief about a particular group of people. So you might call that a stereotype, which leads to a prejudice, which leads to oppression. It is also connected to or learned from broader socioeconomic histories and processes. So it's connected to the things that we learn at school, the things that we learn from consuming the media, the things that we learn from just observing the world around us. And it is supported and reinforced by systemic racism, which I will share next. But again, for this one as well, if there's something you would like to add to this definition of interpersonal racism, you may feel free to do that in the chat. And then next is systemic racism. So this includes the policies and practices entrenched in established institutions. One example of an institution would be schools. It might result in the exclusion or promotion, or does result in the exclusion or promotion of designated groups within those institutions. So even in schools, certain students are privileged in ways that others are not, based on the basis of race. And it differs from overt discrimination in that no individual intent is necessary. And so we see systemic racism occur on the way that teachers distribute permission forms to go on a field trip, for example. So that isn't that the teacher necessarily intended to be to exclude a particular group of students, but because that permission form was handed out at the last minute, it didn't take into consideration like the way that different homes are structured or families' timelines. And so only students who bring their trip form back the very next day would be able to attend that trip. And it wasn't something that the teacher intended to do, but because of the system that is in the school, which allows that sort of thing to happen, students experience discrimination. So that is one example. And again, if you have something that you would like to add in terms of a definition or adding some of your own thoughts around what systemic racism is, you may feel free to add that to the chat.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move through this relatively quickly. I do want to address the Adol's comments in the discussion. There isn't time to really get into this deeply, but I think I'll say that my personal stance, and it's based off of a lot of Black feminist thinkers and scholars, is that you can't have conversations about race without thinking about intersectionality. So intersectionality is a theory that was put forward by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw and has kind of really shaped the field of critical race studies. So that's her contribution to this, is saying that you can't actually talk about race unless you're using an intersectional approach, and that's what we also subscribe to. Well, myself, I won't speak for tomorrow.
Yes.
Okay, so just quickly, colorblindness contributes to racism. Tamara talked about this earlier, the fact that if you don't talk about race, or if you pretend that race doesn't exist or race doesn't shape a lot of social dynamics and power dynamics and institutional oppression in our society, then you're actually contributing to racism. So what Tamara was saying earlier about how not having the conversation is actually probably the most harm you could do, because this is taking a color blindness approach, saying like, I don't see color, I just see humans, things like that, is actually denying the lived experience of a lot of people and the systemic racism that does shape a lot of things in our society. So we don't advocate a color blindness approach. We actually say that you should talk explicitly with your children about race. Just quickly about bias, if you could just go to the next slide, Tamara. We just have to remember that they're similarly, as Tamara was just saying, there's interpersonal and systemic racism. Well, some of that is very explicit, and it's a conscious form of bias or racism where we know it's within our consciousness or awareness that we are committing an act of racism. But a lot of this happens very implicitly. So under that line of our consciousness, the attitudes, stereotypes, beliefs that influence our behaviors. And this happens all the time for kids. They don't, and for adults as well, they don't necessarily think that they are doing something harmful or saying something harmful, but they're being informed by a lot of stereotypes that come from different places, from the media, from school, from their social circles. So we need to look not only at our kids' explicit biases and the ways that they're explicitly racist, or that they might be, or sort of have these ideas that could develop into more explicit racism later, but also what are those implicit beliefs that they have about who's better and who's deserving, and who they should play with, and things like that. So we want to look both at their explicit and implicit biases. This is a really helpful graphic. I think we're sending out this slideshow later so you can look at it in more depth. But the whole point of this graphic is to say that kids need to talk about race right from the very beginning, because they're learning ideas about race right from the very beginning. So at birth, babies look equally at faces of all races, but at 3 months, they prefer to look at faces of their own race. And so that's 3 months, right? And then as they get older, you see, I'll just read a couple of these out. By 2, children as young as 2 years use race to reason about people's behaviors. So very, very early, they're developing ideas about what racism is. And not only the fact that people have differences, but there's a value that is attributed by society towards different people. So it's not just that they're noticing difference, they're noticing that these differences are ascribed different values or judgments based on how our society is organized. So by 30 months, most children use race to choose playmates, and perhaps some of you have seen that in your own kids or your kids' social circles. By 4 and 5, expressions of racial prejudice peak. And so on and so forth. So this is just for us, that we wanted to really emphasize that it's never too early to have this conversation. It just needs to be had in a developmentally appropriate way. But kids are receiving messages about race right from the time that they're born. And it's our responsibility to counter some of that right at the beginning.
Yes, and I just want to add to that as well, that it's also never too late. It is our job as adults in children's lives, irrespective of whether that child is 4 years old or whether they're 14 years old or whether they're 18 years old or I guess 17, to be having those conversations and making them as explicit as possible. So even if you have a child that's in high school right now and you've never had a conversation with them about race and racism, it's not too late for you to begin having that conversation with them, because it's, as we said, it's all around us in the world that we live in, and students are talking about this at school in their classrooms.
T, I feel like we'll have to move through the policy stuff pretty quickly.
I think so too.
Okay, great. Oh, this is me. So, okay, we've already talked about this, so we can pass by. But the main thing we wanted to say was that, you know, some families need to have this conversation right from the beginning as a matter of survival, whereas others, it's a choice. And if you have the choice to do that, it's actually a sign of it actually means you have, it's a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to ignore this and not talk about it, but it's a responsibility for all of us to do that. Do we have time for the video? I'm not sure.
I feel like not. I feel like the strategies are going to be really important. So, as Geeta said, we have a responsibility to ensure that we're having these conversations, even when we have the choice. And I think, you know, as folks who work for the TDSB, we deal with Toronto District School Board policy all the time, but there are other policies that also have to that shape the way that we should be interacting with each other in the world, and also the way that, or the responsibility that we have in terms of educating our children and our students. So here is the Toronto District School Board equity policy. And I just want to, we're just sharing that with you so that you know that these types of conversations, as we mentioned, are happening in schools, but there are actually many levels of policy that call on us to ensure that we are not just not acting in ways that are racist, but also that we are ensuring that in the organizations that we work in, so in our workplaces and in our schools, we are ensuring that there is training that's happening to educate folks on how to address discrimination when it arises, and in our case, to work with our students. So we have there at the national level, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, at the provincial level, the Ontario Human Rights Code, and the Education Act. We also have school board policies and programs that are also part of the Toronto District School Board. So all of these things are here to support us in our work with young people.
Okay, so we're going to get into some really concrete strategies right now. Perhaps these are things that you've used, and perhaps you have other strategies that we're not going to highlight. We're just going to highlight some strategies that we have found, and we know parents have found to be really effective for having some of these conversations. So the first one is asking open-ended questions. So we always want to make sure, okay, so race and racism for a really long time has been considered in some places to be a taboo subject. And that has caused the fear and anxiety that sometimes adults have with talking about race. We transmit that to kids, and they really pick up on that energy, and they learn even through really subtle signals that this is not something to talk about, or this is something scary, or you know, like you could really mess up, so it's better to just leave it. So we want to make sure that we're not sending that message to our kids. So we want to ask really open-ended questions that come from a place of curiosity and not from a place of judgment. So if our kids say something, some kinds of questions we could ask them are like, well, what makes you say that? Or can you tell me more about that? And just really opening it up for them to share what they know and what they've learned, so that you can strategize how you might want to respond to that. And you never have to respond right away if something is out of your area of knowledge. It actually builds so much trust between you and your kids. And I'm sure many of you have seen this before in your own experiences. If you just are honest about the fact you don't know the answer to something, but then you say, I'm going to figure it out and come back to you. We as teachers say that to our students all the time. If we don't know, we're honest about that and we come back. So the first strategy is really just asking questions that opens your kids up to talking about this rather than teaching them that this is scary and shutting down what they have to say. Even if they say something that might seem kind of problematic to you, well, open it up and dig into it with them. Well, what makes you say that? Where did you learn that? Where did that come from? Yeah. And I'm sure there's other kinds of open-ended questions that people could come up with.
And just for the sake of like, ideally this would be a small workshop if we were in a school setting where we would go into breakout sessions and have conversations with each other about what we're doing. So again, the chat is available for you. If there's a strategy that you want to share, or an open-ended question that you found really impactful with your child, feel free to share that in the chat box, because we are here to support each other as much as possible, despite the fact that we are at a distance today. The second strategy we're going to share is reading together. And obviously, not obviously, but this is probably something that you've heard before. But we really want to encourage parents and family members to read as much as possible with your children, and to choose books that maybe have protagonists or main characters that are different from your child and also different from the people in your family, so that you are opening up the door for conversations about experiences that your child might not have in their own personal life, but that they can learn about through reading and interaction with those books. Some of the things that we wanted to highlight here are that only 1% of the children's books published, this is in the United States in 2016, featured Indigenous characters, and even fewer of those, so a quarter of the 1%, which equals 8 books in total, were written by Indigenous authors. So the stats are also really similar at this time in 2016 for Black authors. Obviously, with what has happened in the spring and summer in the world with respect to the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, there has been sort of a rise in an interest in books for teaching children and ourselves about race and racism. So there is a lot more available out there, but there really isn't enough. So that this is still definitely an issue, is accessibility to these types of books, but they are out there and we want to encourage you to find them. Some of the front covers are on this page right now, so you can return to the slideshow later and get some of these titles if you don't already have them. And one thing I'd like to say is that these books are all great for teaching kids about diversity in the world and in the world around them, but there are lots of books too that we probably, we remember, or I certainly remember growing up with on the bookshelves at my school, that weren't great and didn't represent me in any way, and when they did, it wasn't very positive. So I think even going back to some of those books and talking explicitly with children about what's wrong with them, what is wrong with the portrayal of a Black person in this way or an Indigenous person in this way, is also important. It's not just looking at the positive images and praising those, but also looking at the negative ones and deconstructing those with your child, because those are often the images that they are going to encounter in the world.
Can I just add something really quickly?
Of course.
So a couple of things, those are all on that slide, pretty much children's books. And I know that there are some parents of older children in here, but we can send you lists of books. I mean, even if you were to read a novel, the same novel that your kid's reading at school, if it's not in the canon, the white literature canon, if that's all they're reading at school, then that might be an issue too with the pedagogy. But yeah, there are books that are that feature different diverse characters all the way through, and they're a real great place to start conversation. I think it's also important to note that the books that you read with diverse characters don't always have to be about issues and struggles. It can also just be about it can be about anything. We just want to make sure that we're not always representing racialized people as in struggle or as, just singular issue fighting against racism. There's so many other, we have full lives with all sorts of different experiences. So we don't want to get stuck in the trap of only reading about racialized people when they're facing racism or facing struggle. We can also read about racialized people doing all sorts of things. And then the last thing is that this book Hair Love, in case people don't know it, was made into a short film that I believe just won an Oscar quite recently. So that's something really nice to check out.
I saw that Shannon linked a different book list in the chat, so thank you for that. It's one of the stores that we've listed as well, a different book list, another story bookshop, and also Glad Day bookshop, which focuses more on books for LGBTQ communities. But again, thinking just about the importance of intersectionality with that, we wanted to share that resource as well. Again, books are really expensive, so it's not just about you having to buy them for your own home. We'll talk a little bit more about the importance of advocating for this at your school as well. Another place that is really great for reading, and Geeta brought up the fact that there are parents of high school students in here as well. It's important that we use the media. It's another great source for reading information about the world. And we have highlighted a couple of news stories that some of them you may be familiar with. There is the Hurricane Katrina, the images of Hurricane Katrina, the one where the Black person is wading through the water and the caption refers to the person as looting, stealing the information, stealing the bag that he's carrying that has the electronics in it. And when there are two white people wading through the water, it actually says that they found this bag, or I think it was food in their case. The other one is as well, they're finding food from a grocery store in a bag. And in one case, they refer to it as finding. And in the other case, because the person is a person of color, they refer to it as looting. So that is a great opportunity for you to talk to your child about the difference between those two things and why that's happening. And if you look to the far side of the screen, there is a recent article about Kamala Harris, who is running for the role of vice president in the United States. And the news coverage that they said that 25% of the news coverage about her was very specific to her race and her gender. So they said things about her being too ambitious, for example, and it just really speaks to how Black women are treated by the media. And the one there in the center is actually it's not based on a positive news story, but it's really about the fact that sometimes the mainstream media doesn't do a great job of covering people of color and or racialized people in general, but those communities are covering themselves and their issues on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on Snapchat. And so with social media, it's created another opportunity for those communities to share their stories from their perspective and put that information about what's happening to their communities out there in the world. So there are lots of news sources for us to unpack some of what's happening in the world with our children.
Okay, so I mentioned before about the use of developmentally appropriate language. We wanted to touch a little bit on using age-appropriate ideas or concepts when we're having these conversations with kids of various ages. So the first example on the next slide, oh, yes, so kids have a very clear sense of justice, really. Like, you can talk to so many kids and they have this idea, this innate understanding of fairness, of what's fair and what's not fair. You see it on the playground all the time. So you can appeal to ideas that kids already have a really strong understanding of and build on that to help them understand, to kind of extend it into some of these conversations. So if kids have a really clear idea of what's fair and unfair, then moving that into like that concept that they really innately understand into ideas of larger issues around racism and things like that can be a really a much easier way and an access point for them to start to build understandings around these bigger systemic issues. So that's one example. Here's another example. Tamara, why don't you just go ahead and play it and we can talk about it after.
Oh,
be cute. That would Our friends cannot be killed. That would be really sad.
Absolutely, and we
That's why we're protesting now.
Yeah, because we do not want our friends to be killed. We don't want our teachers to be killed. We don't want other students to be killed.
We need our friends, and we need peace too.
We need peace. We absolutely need peace. And guns are not about peace. So we are protesting the presence of all these guns that can go into anybody's hands.
We have to get those guns and put it in the garbage or something.
That's a very, 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 very good argument. We should take these guns and destroy them. There's too many guns and too many guns that can kill too many people.
Step on them or something.
Something, we should break them. They should not be on there. And so we support the Democrats who are pushing for a vote.
And that's why we're protesting.
And you should protest too. Everyone out in the world should protest this.
Okay. So that was Stacey and Chin, who did with her kid a number of videos called, I think it was called Living Room Protest. So just an example of the kind of language that you could use with children where they really do understand what's happening, but just using developmentally appropriate language. On the next slide, there's a link to an article, which I think we'll share this presentation. A couple of people asked, so absolutely you'll be able to access this. And this is a really interesting article that was written about Bree Newsom, who is the person that climbed up the pole and took down the Confederate flag in the States. And this author talks about how she crafted this story that was really current and in the news into a pirate story in order to convey that the message of the story to her child. So there's all these creative ways that you can do that. And so this is a great article that just shows another way, or one way of modifying what can be a really heavy or complex news story into language that young people can understand.
Okay, our next suggestion, or the strategy that we're offering, is to get involved. And there are a variety of ways to do that. So one suggestion is to get involved at school. And this is something that Geetha and I feel really strongly about. And there are lots of examples in the TDSB as of late, the last 2 or 3 years in particular, of parents really getting involved to try to change the way that a school is dealing with racism. So some of the things you can do are speak out against acts of racism at the school. And that can be examples of individual racism, but it can also be examples of systemic racism. That is particularly important. So you want to challenge policies that negatively impact communities of color. You want to advocate for diverse school and classroom libraries. And again, I'll say I really feel strongly about this because books are extremely expensive and families can't, if we are all meant to be doing this work on our own in our homes, it's not going to get done. So we need to be advocating at schools for libraries, for teachers, librarians, for teachers to be bringing these kinds of resources into the classroom so that our children have access to this learning at all times. And for children of color, so that they are seeing themselves represented positively, and also for white children to see children of color represented positively. The other thing that we want to suggest is that you challenge educators to start at the beginning. So as Geetha said earlier, tell stories that include the full existence of a people. As a Black student in the TDSB myself, I remember what it was like when every single year someone decided to talk about Black people. They started with slavery. That is not where Blackness began. And that made my experience as a student in classrooms really uncomfortable. And the same is true for lots of children today. And for those of you who have children who are already in high school, the grade 10 history curriculum starts at World War I. So, what does that say about Canada outside of the context of war, and also about all the Indigenous folks that exist here and existed here then, that have essentially been eliminated from the school curriculum. There was actually an article that came out I just saw it this week, it may have been out a little bit before that, about a grade 8 history textbook that only has in 300 and some odd pages, Black folks specifically are only seen 8 times in these very sentence long descriptions. That's an extremely problematic thing to have happen. So we need to be advocating for this kind of work to be happening at our schools.
And at the same time, we also need to be doing this work in our communities. So schools don't exist as in a bubble. They exist in the context of a much larger community where a lot of these issues are both happening and being challenged. So the more involved you can be in community and bring your kids as well. I see kids all the time at rallies and community events that are for racial justice and for fighting policies and practices that are very racist. The more you can be involved, the better. Research shows that despite what you say, your behaviors around race and racism are what speak to kids the most. So even if you say all the right things, but then kids see that you have a very narrow social circle, you've never advocated for any racial issues, you don't stand up for racialized people, all of these things that are actually actions that you can take, they learn stronger messaging from that than just from what you say. So we wanted to just really encourage you to be as involved in your community in struggles for racial justice as possible. I just did a very cursory search of community events that are related to racial justice that are coming up in the next few days. Some of them are even happening right now. So here's a very short list, but there's so much happening right now from, for example, sorry. Just in a couple days, there's a solidarity action, a global solidarity action for Abdirahman Abdi, who was killed by police in Ottawa, and the person that killed him was just let off with no consequences. So that's an action that's happening really soon. There's also stuff happening around what's happening on the East Coast right now to the Mi'kmaq fishermen. So, keeping as current as possible with the issues that are ongoing right now, the contemporary issues, and bringing your children into those conversations through community and in various ways is really, really important.
So to close this session, we want to just offer you some things to keep in mind. The first is don't always wait for your child to bring up the issue of race or racism. If kids mention race, don't shush them. As Geeta said, use it as an opportunity. And as she just said, kids pick up on your actions just as much as your words. So interrogate your own biases, your language, how you interact with people of different races, and the diversity of your circle of friends. So they are looking at us all the time and watching our behaviors and how we move. So doing our own learning so that we can change those practices or improve those practices is really important.
Yeah, just the last few ones, intervening when you hear or see racism, that could be a whole other workshop, and it is in many places. So not being a bystander and just actively intervening is really important. A lot of people like to say that anti-racism is a verb, meaning you have to actually act to be anti-racist. And keep having the conversation. It's not the talk that you have once and then it's over. It's an ongoing conversation that you need to be having with your kids over the course of their lives. And if something messes up, it's okay. You can always return back to it, or you can always go learn more and come back and bring the conversation up again. Just keep it ongoing.
So with that, Geeta and I would like to thank you for your participation today. Our workshop time is technically up, but if anyone has any questions that you would like to ask, or again, strategies that you would like to share in the chat box, feel free to do so now. The presentation, the slide deck will be available to you along with links to the resources that we shared today.
And thank you so much for all of your comments and questions. It was really great. Yeah, I'll put up both of our emails in the chat right now.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Esther, I'm glad that was in the news today. I saw an article about it. Someone had forwarded it to me on social media or something like that. And it looked kind of lengthy. So I was hoping that the news would pick it up so it would be short enough for other people to pay attention to. Because I think often with these types of stories, they end up in someone's master's work, but never actually make it to the public. So I'm glad that it's out there. Of course,
All right.
Esther, go ahead.
I know, good afternoon, everyone. I know people are still here, but one of the things that I struggle with as a parent was with identity, because I am a mixed race person, and my my so many races are in my background, ethnicities, and sometimes when people ask, you know, like, what are you? I'm like, oh, I'm just a big melting pot. And then they would say, oh, but you look one way. How do you identify? And it's hard to identify with one side when you know there are other pieces of the puzzle, you know, within within my makeup. So sometimes it's hard. And what advice would you give um, to explain that sometimes to people, or even because I have a son, and even to my son, because so far he's in grade 6 and he hasn't really experienced any like serious like racism and things like that, but he just started middle school, and I want to know sometimes like how do I put that over to him, because I myself, I'm a mixed person. And like I went to one workshop before, and I remember they were talking about Black people. And I said, so what do you define as Black? Because I see myself, I am not Caucasian. I see myself as a Black woman. But then other people may think that I am not a Black woman because I am not of African ancestry. At least they don't see that when they look at me visually. You know, so it was sort of like very conflicting for me at times. How would you help me out there, please?
I see that. I think that is very complex, Esther. And I guess my honest opinion, my honest position on that might be that you just be honest about the complication. I think that this is the way that the world has been constructed, as we talked about before, the idea of race being a social construction. So people's immediate instinct is to put us into a box, you know, like we try to determine like, oh, what race is that person? What gender is that person, in order to make the world make sense to us somehow. And I think that it's important for those of us who are committed to anti-oppression to make a conscious effort to challenge that every single time that it happens. So I don't mean that somehow, like, you know, I also come from a very mixed background, but I do consider myself to be a Black woman. And where there are opportunities for me to talk to people about what it means. For example, you know, you've probably heard the classic case of like, where are you from? And I'll say I'm from Toronto, and then they'll say like, no, but where are you really from? And I'll say, no, actually this is where I'm from. But you know, there's a lot more to to who I am that like shapes my identity and influences the decisions that I make. And with people who I think it's worth having the conversation with, I will go into all of those layers. So I would encourage you to do the same thing. If people are defining you in a way that makes you uncomfortable, I think you can challenge that definition. Because you get to decide who you are. You get to self-identify. We don't get to, you know, as individuals, we shouldn't get to decide who somebody is. So I think that in those conversations with you and with your child, you should just encourage that. How does that feel to you? Does that feel uncomfortable?
No, it doesn't actually. Sometimes, you know, I try, like you said, if it's worth it, you get into a conversation with the other person because you understand where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes it's kind of difficult too, you know, because people, like you said, they would look at you and put you in a compartment already, not knowing your background, or they may think, oh, you look a certain way, and they feel comfortable talking about another race because you look a certain way, but then they don't realize that, hey, that other race is part of me too, you know? So I'm like, oh, okay. You know, and you get that a lot. It's quite uncomfortable being a mixed race person. I can tell you from my perspective, it's very uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But thank you. This workshop was great. I wish we had more time to explore. This is a huge topic, but I certainly appreciate the content that you all put out, especially with the books. And I would do my part to advocate as a parent in my son's for the library, especially for the library. So thanks again, ladies.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for sharing your experience with us, Esther, and for your help in sorting out the rooms at the beginning, like the waiting room and all of that, because that really helped us. Thank you.
Yes, not a problem. I do it every day. I'm online every day with my children. So I have a program I run, an online after school program, and it had to be online because of COVID. So I'm versed in it fully.
Great.
So
Thank
it
you
was
so
good
much.
meeting you all, Tamara and Geeta, and for all who joined, I hope that they took something away that was helpful. At least we can get the conversation started, as uncomfortable as it may be, and try to make a difference, a positive difference in the world going forward.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you, Esther.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye.
Tamara, there was a question that was sent to me privately, and then I see that Shannon also has a question. So is it okay, like we can take a couple minutes to?
Yeah, I'm totally fine.
Okay, great. So the question that was sent was, I have questions about how to immediately respond to very negative topics that come up. Specifically, my kids recently asked about the N word and the P word, slavery, Holocaust, residential schools, etc. I get riled up and angry speaking about these topics, and I think it scares them and get mad at the topic. I get very passionate, which is maybe fine because these are scary topics. But would you suggest that we not let our anger and passion show, or is that okay? I have some initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead, Geeta?
Sure. So my initial thoughts on that are, I think there is a place for anger and passion in this work, because so much of what's happening in the world and happening to people is enraging. It's completely enraging, and I think that there's a place for righteous anger. I do. That's what fuels a lot of people's important change-making work in our societies. Is a lot of things, but for some people, it is fueled by a lot of anger and frustration at the injustice. So I think that there absolutely is a place for that. And where I try to sort of check myself is whether my anger and my passion is shutting down the conversation or if it's opening up the conversation. So if I notice that my own sort of like feelings about everything is shutting things down and not giving my students, for example, a chance to share how they feel and add their nuances in and their learning and things like that, then then maybe I want to sort of like mitigate that a little bit, just to make sure that it's not shutting down the conversation. So if my anger is fueling this like really robust just dialogue and discussion about all these issues we've never talked about before, then totally then it's good, right? Like, I mean, I'm sure that Tamara and I and perhaps other people in here have it ignited sort of some of that passion in our students through our own passion about these topics. So I think there's place for it for sure. And I see people commenting here. So let me see what, so Melissa said, interesting, good distinction. Laurette, depending on the age of your children, show your passion, but reduce the anger so they know it's a safe topic to discuss. And then Cherie, I believe we do need to be authentic, but own the intensity of our feelings and balance it, as depending on the age, they may avoid asking again or exploring. So all really great advice. And I hope that adds a bit of, a couple different perspectives to the question. Tamara?
No, I think that was excellent. My first thought was, if you're not angry right now with what's happening around us in the world, then you're not paying attention. So I think that the passion is definitely necessary. But I think Geeta, Cherie, and Laurette shared a really important point. Shannon wanted to ask a question as well.
Hi there. Thank you for this great workshop. My question is, do you know if the TDSB already has something in place for parents to advocate for a more diverse staff at their school? Our staff is very homogenous, and I'm wondering how that can change, because I think it's important for kids to see themselves and also to see others, especially when you were talking about, being in a diverse community.
Mara, do you want me to offer a few thoughts?
So I think so on the slide where we mentioned getting involved at your school, that was one of the things we considered putting on there, was advocating for more diverse staff at schools. It's one of those things in the TDSB, at least right now, where it's absolutely necessary, as you're saying, and important to do. There is no real process to make it happen at the TDSB beyond having those conversations with school staff. So talking to principals, vice principals, superintendents, and, you know, being that voice that's pushing for change. But there isn't actually a process in place for that at this time. Geeta, do you know something else?
No, I just wanted to add that principals have a lot of hiring power, especially now because about a week ago, they changed the hiring policies for new teachers. And not just new teachers, just teachers with lower seniority. So principals have even more power than they had before around hiring. So advocating directly to your principal is really important. Also, the board, in their equity policy, they do talk about hiring and employment equity. So that it is something that they're supposed to be following. So another sort of place where you could advocate is to the board itself, saying, well, this is your policy. How is this actually being implemented? And you know, what are the stats on this? So I see a couple of different levels and places where you could advocate, but there is no formal process yet, as Tamara.
Okay, thank you so much.
Parent pressure makes a big difference for administrators and for the board. It really does.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, unless anyone else has questions, I think we might cap this off. So maybe just speak up now if you do.
And if not, thank you so much for coming and for staying for the discussion, and have a great rest of your day. Enjoy your next session.